Actually, you can take the man out of the uniform, but you can't take the uniform out of him. I'll put it
Correct.
in another way. तो yes, tends to happen is कि आप एक young age में join करते हैं and you are what are the basic skills of leadership of of life skills, the various other things that you imbibe in your life are learnt at a very young age, at a very young stage. तो वो आपके साथ रहती हैं. कुछ और चीज़ें हैं जो फ़ौज के बारे में हैं, जो आपके साथ रहती हैं. फ़ौज में वैलर की बातें करते हैं, ब्रेवरी की
Right.
बातें करते हैं, दूसरी बातें करते हैं. बट वन ऑफ दोज़ थिंग्स आई हैव acquired from Forge is, our things about ethics, our culture, our camaraderie, and these stand you in good stead as you move along in life.
Cool. Okay, well, hello and welcome once again to Kitaabi Baatein. I'm Abhishek, also known as Books Wale Bhaiya. My guest today is the best-selling author Probal DasGupta. Probal sir, welcome. It's welcome pleasure to have you here on my podcast.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. It's a privilege and a pleasure for me. Delighted to be here.
So Prabal, as I all know, he's an ex-army man. He served in the Indian Army for about a decade. He then left the army to join the corporate world and is now running his own consulting firm, Birdstone Consulting. So, Prabal, let me start with the basic idea. Served the Indian Army for 10 years, and after which you left to join the corporate world. But when I read your books and the passion which I saw in these two books and the depth of research, I think you left the army, but probably it looks like the army never left you. What would you say
Yeah,
about that?
yeah, that's a good way to put it. Actually, you can take the man out of the uniform, but you can't take the uniform out of him. I'll put it
Correct.
in another way. तो yes, tends to happen is कि आप एक young age में join करते हैं and you are what are the basic skills of leadership, of life skills, the various other things that you imbibe in your life are learnt at a very young age, at a very young stage. तो वो आपके साथ रहती हैं. कुछ और चीज़ें हैं जो फ़ौज के बारे में हैं, जो आपके साथ रहती हैं. फ़ौज में वैलर की बातें करते हैं, ब्रेवरी की
Right.
बातें करते हैं, दूसरी बातें करते हैं. बट वन ऑफ दोज़ थिंग्स आई हैव acquired from Forge is, our things about ethics, our culture, our camaraderie, and these stand you in good stead as you move along in life. And also, as you grow, as you go, and as you travel in life, you realize that amongst the best lessons that you learned was very early on in life. और
Right.
तब आप जो है ना पूरे चीज़ों का जो आपकी लाइफ एक्सपीरियंसेस का आगे पीछे वो कुछ दोहराते हैं और आप देखते हैं कि द बेस्ट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन दैट यू वुड हैव वर्क फॉर वाज द इंडियन आर्मी, which is without a shadow of doubt. And yes, to your point, you can take a man out of, or a woman, or now out of the Indian Army or the Indian military, Army, Navy, Air Force, but you
Right.
have some part of it within him or her at all times.
Absolutely. So coming to books, let me start with your latest book, which is Camouflaged. And for all those who are watching, by any chance you have not read the book, that is something I strongly urge you to go through this book. This is I would say one of the best books I have read on Indian Army, and I in fact won't call it a book on army. I would call it a book on our history, a very important part of history, which is to my extreme surprise is forgotten and not much talked about. So, sir, talking about this book, wherein you have covered a lot of unheard stories of the Indian Army, my first question is actually related to that. Why is it that India, being having one of the largest armies, and there's a lot of respect for Indian Army personnel in general, the army has fought many battles and many skirmishes on the front. Why is it that such important critical stories are unheard of? Why haven't people heard of it before? Why is it that after several years and in some cases even after a century, we have authors like you who are bringing these stories to the forefront?
Abhishek, that's a very good question to start with. And I think that's a question that always occupies at the top of my head. Well, One of the things that you said at the start of the question is something that actually amplifies the reason. We You said it was our story, it was a story from our history, not just
Yes.
from the army or military. I think that is a part of the answer. We haven't looked at it that way. We I hear people saying, oh, we are doing military stories, or we are not doing military stories at this event, we are doing a separate one there. I don't think they are stories about people from another planet of Neptune or Mars or some other place. These are stories of you and I. These are stories of us. And these are stories at a point of time in history which contributed to the development of civilization, the world order, and also the more importantly so, the trajectory, the growth of this country. So, therefore, when I chose the theme of this book, Camouflage, and thanks for the kind words about the book, really appreciate it. I'm glad that you liked it. Camouflaged has a theme which is actually 10 stories over 100 years that run alongside the trajectory of India's history. So, this is not
Correct.
about the military alone, but the story of the country, the history of the country, the last 100 years, seen from the lens of stories from battlefields.
Correct.
Why is that so? And we have these three parts, and we can come to that
Yes.
in the during the course of our discussion. But to your point, to your question, as to why these have not been covered, there are several reasons. One of the things that I talk about is that and this is something that this is very nuanced, and this is my point of view, that if you look at the stories pre independence, at that point of time India was going through, as the world was going through, a different kind of a turmoil, where you had the Germans, the Axis powers, the Allied powers. The world was going through two world wars, trying to establish itself, trying to get a grip on how the world has to be run in a sane order. First you had a global organization that was formed in 1919 which failed, and then 1945 the United Nations got formed. So all of this was going on in the world. But while that was going on in India, we had the freedom movement, and India
Yes.
was rightly so, was was very much focused on that freedom movement, whether it was Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and Gandhiji and Vallabhbhai Patel and Pandit Nehru and everybody else. So
Yes.
all of this was, in that period India was focused on the freedom movement. The rest of the world was going through another kind of turmoil.
Yes.
Now, the war literature that came out of that turmoil can be seen in the writings of Siegfried Sassoon or Ernest Hemingway or several other, Eric Maria Remarque's book, All Quiet on the Western Front. So there are several books, several literature works that came out in that period, which are the outcome of the wars.
Yes.
India was going through a different stage in history, and India's stage was connected with its freedom movement
Yes.
and the struggles around it. So आप देखेंगे the literature that comes out in that period for India is all about India's freedom movement,
India's
very
freedom.
little about the war, which has only come now as
True.
historians have dug deeper into that period and pulled out lots of works and content to create literature. And there are some great works in the last few years which have been produced about, from World War I, from World War II. It was a forgotten war, First World War,
Yes.
and
True.
Indians actually contributed to the
Yes.
establishment of the world order in the First World War and
True.
the Second World War. And one and
You
a half
mentioned
million
more than a
Indians.
million
Yeah.
Indian soldiers fought,
G.
in,
Yeah.
that about more than 70,000 died.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet,
Yeah. Yeah.
I, having read all the books, got to know about this statistic from your book. So, of
G.
course,
Yeah, and you see what happened is, our somewhere, for some reason, we lost lost sight of the role of military in
yes,
the establishment of a nation.
true,
Nation
very
की
true.
जो culture है,
True.
or we took birth in a neighborhood that was full of different kinds of turmoil, and it
Correct.
was a troubled neighborhood. But we did not understand the military right from the get go. तो हमने
True.
1947-48 में ही, 48 में the first thing that we had was the war with Pakistan over Kashmir, and there
Pakistan.
again the military was involved, the army was
Correct.
involved. Then you had the 1962, 65, 71, सारे जगह हमारे neighborhood की struggles जो थी, और as a country, a new country was establishing itself in a troubled neighborhood during those years, the military, the army, played a major role.
Major
And
role.
but what happened was that हमारा जो नजरिया था, the outlook we had towards the army was very very poor, unfortunately. So
True.
1947, we also, the leaders of the day thought at that time that the army was not very necessary. But if you look back, it was the army that ensured that the territorial integrity of the country was maintained in the era of wars of 40s and
Very true.
60s.
Very true.
But as I was saying, the evolution of our thinking of the role of army towards nation building has only taken place in recent years, not
That's very
earlier on. And also because of the reasons that I mentioned, that the country went into that struggle, and the struggle was a non-violent struggle. So all of those books were written around 1947, and the struggle and the freedom movement. There was no, the roles of Indian army, the military and soldiers in nation building was
nation building. That's true.
absolutely, yeah, I would say not forgotten. I wouldn't say forgotten. I would say they were blindsided. They were unremembered. They were not even mentioned, which is an
I think one of
unfortunate part.
True. I think one of the reasons was also that when we talk of our freedom struggle, and as you rightly
Hmm.
mentioned, we were concerned with our freedom at that point of time. I think
G.
because largely the narrative is that we got our
Hmm.
azadi by without the violence. De di hame azadi bina khadak bina dhal. Something which is
G.
also being debated now, something which is being
Yeah.
contested, because our focus was
Right.
that we got our freedom to
Hmm.
non-violent means.
Yeah.
No wonder Subhash Chandra Bose's contribution was not given that much importance. If you see in our
Yeah.
history book, you just
Yes.
find one small chapter. Okay, he made some Indian Army, Indian National Army, INA, and that's it. No one recognizes the importance of his contribution, the contribution of Indian National Army and the Royal Navy mutiny, which gave the final push to the British Empire. And also, I think somewhere people had this feeling because the soldiers you talked about, Laddie Singh and Kirat in the First World War, I guess people might have took it as oh, they fought for the British, so why should we celebrate India was a British colony, and why should we
Hmm.
celebrate even
Hmm.
the martyrdom of someone like those who fought for the British, they didn't fight for
Yeah.
the Indian. I
Yeah.
think these
Yeah.
narratives did play around, but
Hmm.
as you
Hmm.
say, what is more important is that we look at army as not just a unit of soldiers, but what role it plays in the nation building. I think that
Yes.
was, I
Yes.
think you're very right, that was largely,
Hmm.
forgotten.
Yes. Yes. And if you look at the countries that took shape in the era of 40s and 50s, you will see that many of those countries have had a backstory where the army, the military has had a role to play in
Yes,
establishing the order and the outlook of the country, the
yes,
order within and the outlook
true,
outside, where the country looks at its foreign policy, looks at the neighborhood, looks at the global order with a certain lens. And I think
yes,
we needed to have that lens in
true,
place, which we missed out on. And we suffered. We
absolutely,
suffered in the 60s. We suffered. We were given a hard time in the early 60s. The good thing
true,
is that we recovered. We recovered, and that's how you have Watershed 1967. And
very
I'm
true.
telling you, Abhishek, this is again a theory, maybe a conspiracy theory of some sort. But if 1962 hadn't happened, can you imagine if 1962 hadn't happened, we were not given the kind of setbacks that we were given by China?
Right.
We would have gone on in the kind
So
of
true.
happy go lucky ways that we were
Yes,
going on. We had an inept military leadership. I have no qualms in saying that. It was an inept, absolutely incompetent military senior leadership. And I say that it's on record. And you had an inept political leadership, and it would have gone on. And can you imagine what would have happened in the 1965 war? What would have happened at Chola and Nathula in 1967? And what
67.
would have finally happened? Would we have had a friendly neighborhood in the eastern part? That's a question we should be
Very true.
asking.
No, no, that's very true. I remember in Chanakya Niti, Acharya Chanakya mentioned that it's always difficult
Yeah,
to maintain cordial relations with your close
yeah,
neighbors. That's he told
hmm,
some thousand of years back, but looks like
yeah,
our leader probably did
yeah,
not take the
hmm,
lessons. So in the first part of a book which deals with the pre-independence history of the Indian Army. So we
right.
talked about these soldiers contributed in the first world. The third chapter I think which was about the soldiers being made prisoners of wars, and he finally left, and he got commissioned about a decade later on. I think that was one
Hmm,
of the stories which we look at beyond the battlefield and army and ammunition. I
hmm,
think that makes you understand the importance of, you can say, the human emotions, because once you're a prisoner of war,
hmm,
don't know what's going to happen. I think that is something which touches upon this emotion part as well. And I think being a prisoner of war is perhaps more, can be more scary or frightening than being on the
hmm.
battlefield, because we hear a lot of atrocities on the prisoners of war. So how do you see this emotion being there, or the human emotions being there when we talk of army? Because when we talk of army, we always think of bravery and valor, and we forget that
Ji,
they are also humans.
ji,
So
ji.
how do you see
So,
that
yeah,
emotions coming in
yeah,
that story?
yeah, yeah. So, one of the things that I wanted to do with this book was to explore the various dimensions of conflicts, stories, emotions, and the various experiences. So, when you say battlefields, these are all battlefields. 2611 was a battlefield. How do we define battlefields? Battlefields are, you know, conflict zones, areas where there's high risk, where there's an enemy, there's an adversary, there's a conflict going on. There are different kinds of means and tools used to impose damage, injury, loss on either side, and there's an element of strong aggression. There is, so it could be a classical conflict, it could be a conflict such as what was going on in the insurgencies of Jammu and Kashmir and northeast of India in the 80s and 90s, and now it could be a classical war, such as of 1965 or the conflict of 1962-71 or the battles of 1967. So and also the air battles of the First World War, which I have spoken about, and the one that you speak about, which is the prisoner of war story, which is again a very interesting one. Why is that here important? Is because it also tells us about a story of resilience, about a
Yes,
story of someone who had gone through this entire war, looking at the war from another angle, which
another.
was in the prisons, from various prisons that he was put in. He was also going through the battle. He was also going through the war. His ship was torpedoed. A ship of prisoners was torpedoed, and he was
Yes,
he was close to dying. He was barely surviving. He was on the ocean. It was like Tom Hanks in Castaway, where he was taken on
yes,
board by German boats. Now, that story, as a prisoner of war, he gets to reflect on the cause of war. And I'll leave it for readers to evaluate. He at a certain point in time, he wants, there is that last towards the end when he's in Berlin and he's in the prisoner of war camp, and his own planes, the Allied planes, come bombing the prisoner of
yes,
war camp because the war is ending and the Germans are losing and the Allied forces are winning. तो वो advance कर रहे थे. And at that point of time, when they were bombing, he and his German captors, who till the previous day were at loggerheads with each other, and the German captors were actually, you know, really their enemies, enemy number one. They and so the prisoners, which is Charan Singh Dhillon, the character in the story,
yes,
and Americans and French and Englishmen who were also with him in the prison camp, they were telling the Germans where to hide, and the Germans would tell them where to hide. It was a very interesting irony of sorts, and he asks that question that yahan par I and my captors are trying to help each other save ourselves from the bombs that are falling from the sky, and these bombs are being dropped by my friendly forces, by the allies who till yesterday were on the same side as I.
True.
Whose war am I fighting? Have I come
Exactly.
so far to be killed by my own people? So that is a dilemma of war that he puts forth. So वो कहानी एक prisoner of war की है. वो कहानी ऐसे आदमी की है जो वॉर के अलग अलग थिएटर्स देखता है, अफ्रीका से जा करके यूरोप में चले जाता है, and is also going through the oceans, also going through several moments of near death experiences where he's
True.
almost about to be shot, almost gets killed, but every time he escapes. And that's the beauty of fate, of destiny. And he destiny, conflict, dilemma, escapes, these are all elements in that story which
True.
he discovers in a war through the lens of a prisoner of war.
That's very true. And I think when we talk of emotions, we have more stories. One is about Nizamu and about Shoaib.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, somehow आप कह सकते हैं, it reinforces, our belief in
Hmm,
humanity, that even if we talk of war, there are things beyond war जो आप सिर्फ मिलिट्री और आर्मी और उस सबके कॉन्टेक्स्ट में नहीं देख सकते.
hmm,
इस ह्यूमैनिटी
hmm,
कहीं ना
hmm,
कहीं, in some way or the
hmm,
other, it is there. But before that, जो आपके second part
hmm,
of the book, which deals with
hmm.
post independence. So the first story, Chewang Rinchen, I think एक और एस्पेक्ट जो अनकवर हुआ है वो ये है कि जब हम 47 की बात करते हैं, वी फोकस ऑन कश्मीर, बट
जी,
आपने जैसे बात करी, इट वाज अबाउट लद्दाख.
जी.
It was part of the entire state of Jammu
Hmm,
Kashmir.
hmm,
But I think कहीं ना कहीं हम उसकी इम्पोर्टेंस को भूल गए, and this
hmm,
is even
hmm,
not
hmm.
about army history as you talked about. This is
जी,
about our history, which is very much linked to independence struggle. लद्दाख
बिल्कुल.
भी जा सकता
जी,
था.
जी,
आई थिंक सम
जी.
हम शायद वो भी भूल गए
Hmm,
कि हाउ वी हैड
hmm,
ब्रेव सोल्जर्स लाइक
hmm,
शेवांग रिंचन, जिन्होंने
hmm.
लद्दाख को भी पाकिस्तान में जाने से बचाया. तो
जी,
आर्मी के साथ साथ हम शायद अपनी ज्योग्राफी को भी भूल गए. इट्स समथिंग
जी,
व्हिच अगेन आई गॉट टू नो फ्रॉम योर स्टोरी. हाउ डू यू सी दैट? एक और
जी,
इम्पोर्टेंट हिस्ट्री हम अपनी, हमने शायद इम्पोर्टेंस ही नहीं दिया.
जी. नहीं, आपकी बात बिल्कुल सही है, एंड दैट वाज वन ऑफ माय थॉट्स एज वेल व्हेन आई वाज राइटिंग दिस. देखिए, बात यह है कि हम कश्मीर को लेके ऑब्सेस्ड रहे हैं
यस.
1948 से.
यस.
इतना ऑब्सेस्ड रहे हैं कि हम किसी और जगह देख ही नहीं पाए हैं. एंड लद्दाख इज अ केस इन पॉइंट.
ट्रू.
The fact is that at that, and I'm telling you, a lot of people do not know, have no idea that we were this close to losing Ladakh had it
एग्जैक्टली.
not been for Shivang Rinchen. Let me be
ट्रू.
very clear that we were very close to losing Ladakh, and we would have been sitting, you and I would have been talking about Himachal being our boundary, and
ट्रू.
something like that. So we had gotten used to sort of taking whatever history was giving us in terms of the outcomes, and Chewang Rinchen and his in terms of the outcomes. And Chewang Rinchen and his band of soldiers changed that. So did
ट्रू.
the soldiers in Kashmir when Hari Singh signed the instrument of accession. My point of this story was also this, that since the focus was on Kashmir, let us understand what happened in Ladakh. And an
लद्दाख.
incredible story was waiting to be told about Ladakh. Shivang Rinchen's story has been told in another book by Shivang Rinchen's daughter and someone else. Major Ajay Raina, I think he's written very well about him. But I thought, that this story needed to be told from another dimension, and this story needed to be told uh, again through certain ways and means which had probably not been explored, and in the light of the fact that here was a story that was important to the growth of a new nation,
Of
and
course.
it had happened right at the juncture after our independence. And I wanted to highlight how Ladakh was very important and what had happened there.
Yeah.
Another reason, another issue that I wanted to highlight there was the role of a 17-year-old. We talk about military stories, and you rightly said, they're not people who are living in another area, they're part of us. So this is a story about a 17-year-old boy who's not is not an army soldier to begin with.
Yes.
He's a local boy. So when uh, Colonel Prithvi Singh goes to the Leh Square in Ladakh and asks for volunteers, he says, who is going to help me? He had a small band of 25 odd men, and he wanted people locally to volunteer and help him. in the protection of Ladakh against the invaders who were coming from the west, from Skardu and that side, from Pakistan. But there were no hands that had gone up. There was just
Right.
one hand at the back of the crowd that went up, and that hand was of a 17-year-old boy, Shivang Rinchen.
Okay.
So that started his journey. I wanted to highlight how anyone, a citizen of India, can actually play an important role in nation building. And he got together a band of 28, 30 people. He formed a Nubra Guards force, and subsequently he joined the Indian Army. He rose to the rank of colonel, and he fought all wars from 1947 to 1971. He
71.
fought
Yes.
all wars that India fought. He fought all
Yes.
those wars. He got two Mahavir Chakras and one Sena medal. He, all the wars that he fought, he lost none. He won all of them. And
Very true.
yeah, and he won and he fought and won at the highest point in 1971. I forget the height, but it's there in the book. And he and his band of soldiers went and ascended the Pakistani defense, the post, and surprised the Pakistani defenses, who hadn't expected Shivang Rinchen and his men to actually climb that post. So it was remarkable. His story was one that actually, if you look at 1947 to 71, is his story. वो कहते हैं ना कि वो बांधता है पूरा, it just weaves the entire history of
Correct.
that period and the conflicts, and he is like a sutradhar running through all of those stories.
Very true.
47, 62 में भी थे, 65 में, 71 में. So it's kind of, in that one story, if you see, there are these few parts where he goes and he's actually responsible for bringing back four villages of India
Yes.
that were in Pakistan, which had been left behind in 1948 because he was asked to stop and not go any further. And वो उस वक्त उन्होंने एक प्रण लिया था. He had taken an oath that he will someday complete the unfinished task. And there you go. 25 years later, he did.
Very true. So you talked of this unfinished task. So, we fought Pakistan
Hmm.
many times. The last one in 1998. It is said by many that, despite
Yeah.
we being in the
Hmm.
position of advantage, we did not,
Hmm.
utilize it. When we are
Right.
militarily typically
Hmm.
stronger than Pakistan,
Hmm.
even
Hmm.
economically. Why you
Yeah.
think that happened? I think 1970 was the best example wherein we had a thumping
Hmm.
victory,
Hmm.
and but
Hmm.
yet we returned all the prisoners of war.
Yeah.
We did not negotiate at all. So do you think
Right.
the history of the
Hmm.
army was deeply linked to politics, of course, but somewhere the politics failed the army in that sense?
Well, I think, let me put it this way: the army did its job. The
Yes,
politicians failed us at the table,
right.
because the army doesn't negotiate at the table. It's the politicians and the bureaucrats who do.
Right.
But without sounding oversimplistic, let me also say that we have not been very good with treaties. We did
Yes,
not do very well in the Tashkent Treaty in
correct.
1965. We did not do very well in the 1972 Shimla Treaty as well. So, if you ask me, 1971, the Eastern Front was one. The Western Front was, we did very well. We had made a lot of progress there. But the fact is that, the Shimla Accord subsequently did not address the issue of 54, 55 Indian soldiers who have continued to remain in Pakistan, whereas we
Yes,
gave away 93,000 soldiers of Pakistani army, which India had captured after the 1971 war. Now, if you political दांव पैंच उसके अंदर क्या है कि मुजीबुर रहमान पाकिस्तान में थे और मुजीबुर रहमान को वापस लाना था, और वो जो टाइमिंग दोनों की अग्रीमेंट हुई थी कि मुजीबुर रहमान was to come back to then East Pakistan, and India wanted to ensure that Mujib is safe to take over East Pakistan, which would
yes,
otherwise have run into turmoil. So,
true.
as I said, without being oversimplistic, there were issues, there were, tougher issues to deal with. India would have had, we've had very experienced diplomats, but let's admit that we didn't get the deal that we should have got. these are issues that come up after every after a war. These are issues that are bound to come up after a war. But I think somewhere, given the fact that we let all 93 prisoners of Pakistan go back without
Yes.
negotiating for 54 Indian prisoners that have stayed back in their camps, does not justify the reason that we were trying to save Mujibur Rahman. I think, at the table, we lost. We lost in Tashkent in 1965. We lost in Shimla in 1972. We did not drive a harder bargain that we should have.
Very true.
and
So,
and
coming,
and not to say 1948. I mean, it started
of
from
course,
there. Again, we went to the United Nations when we should not have,
we
right?
should not have.
And और वही मेरी बात जो पहले मैंने बताया उसी को दोहराता है कि we did not understand the role of the military in nation building, which is why
True.
we did not understand why we needed to go forward in 1948 and not backward to over our shoulders and looked at the United Nations.
Very true. So coming again to those facts that we were not prepared, and when we could have bargained better. I think it all links to what happened in 2008. I'm just fast forwarding to
Yeah,
the last chapter
yeah.
of your book
Hmm.
about
Hmm.
2611, and once
Ji.
again it's the defense forces, NSG, and all which played a
Yeah.
role. I think one of the highlights was that when the NSG was looking for the Chabad house, they could not find
Hmm.
it.
Yeah.
Such it showed basically the unpreparedness that
Hmm.
if something of that
Hmm.
sort happens, it's okay, we didn't
Right.
have that much technology like Google Maps and all.
Hmm.
And of course,
Yeah.
otherwise everyone knows that
Hmm.
we were
Hmm.
not at all
Hmm.
prepared.
Hmm.
The rampage
Hmm.
went on for 3 days. They
Hmm.
targeted some of the
Hmm.
most critical spots, and once
Right.
again, more importantly, first we were not
Hmm.
prepared, and more importantly, we did not do anything after that.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a massive attack. It was a war. Let's not deny
Yes.
it. It was a
Yes.
war.
Yes.
Yet
Yes.
we did not do anything. And the joke
Hmm.
was that, the ministry will do the Kadi Ninda. It became
Hmm.
a joke that a Kadi Ninda
Yeah.
karenge
Yeah.
or
Ji.
do you
Ji.
think that even till 2008 हमने वो lessons नहीं learn करे जिनकी हम बात करें 60s या 70 की? It took us like more than what 40-50 years to make our
Hmm.
position
Hmm.
clear, to tell the
Hmm.
world,
Hmm.
if you do something
Hmm.
against us, we have examples
Hmm.
like in the past few
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
But it
I
took
think.
so long.
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yes. Yes. I think we did not learn our lessons. To answer you in one line, I don't think it's a very complicated answer to give. We did not learn our lessons. Otherwise, if you look at 2008 for instance, आप उसकी बात कर रहे हैं, मैं उसी से स्टार्ट करता हूँ. 2008 की जो कहानी है, which I have written here in as a last story of the book.
Right.
This इसकी जो postscript है, उसमें मैंने I have written a bit about what happened in the run up to 2611. The home minister delayed the travel of the
Yes.
national security guards
Yes.
to Mumbai, to the site of the terrorist attack, and they were delayed for over 4 hours. And I'm quoting the then undersecretary and joint secretary who have made public statements as to how India was damaged by the delay caused by the then Home Minister, Mr. Shivraj Patil, because of whom that the NSG could not travel for quite a while, and they were delayed in their flight from Delhi to Mumbai after having traveled from Manesar. So that is number one. Number two, that shows how prepared were we, how you know how what kind of an attitude we had. We had a very laissez-faire, lackadaisical attitude towards the whole thing. Number two, we did not have a proper coordination between the intelligence and the NSG,
True.
because I have also mentioned in the story, and I have spoken with Colonel Sandeep Sen, I've spoken with several others who have operated in 2611, that they had no information. Did not have any advantage of the intelligence intercepts that were being acquired, which were acquired when the terrorists sitting inside Nariman House or in Taj or in several other locations that they were in were interacting with their handlers in Karachi or wherever in Pakistan. Those bits of information which were very important for the NSG commandos when they were operating inside the building were not provided to them, which is
Yes.
such a shame. Which is such a
True.
shame that they were not provided that those bits of information, which could have perhaps saved more lives.
true.
and which have were tided over later when the report was tabled to the state government here in Maharashtra. The report was not accepted, and the report had laid bare the inefficiencies, the lack of competence, and the inability of the machinery to take on the attack of such magnitude.
True.
And those reports have actually been put forward, but unfortunately they were never made public. The fact is that this was number two: the lack of intelligence, the coordination between the intelligence agencies and the operating agencies, which is the NSG at that time. And the third was again a lack of preparedness. So the lack of attitude,
True.
the lack of right attitude, lack of coordination, and lack of preparedness. The third thing I want to talk about is the lack of preparedness, because if you read in the story, the militants, and you spoke about Google Maps, we didn't need to get to Google Maps.
Yes, exactly.
We needed to actually have our maps. Even people
True.
in the local police, the state machinery did not know when Nariman House
Exactly.
was. When Colonel
Exactly.
Sandeep Sen arrived, he was guided to that building by a local
Local.
Mumbai Jew who
True. True.
who fortuitously, who by chance happened to track that bus of NSGs, which is going from various one place to the other, from the state secretariat to the police station to everywhere, and they were frustrated that they hadn't been able to locate Nariman House. It was a house without an address for us, whereas terrorists who had come from Pakistan were very easily able to identify not just the house but the route to the house and from where they would enter. They had all those details, we had none, which
We didn't
showed
have
our lack of preparedness. In fact, there were
preparedness.
intelligence intercepts that had come from Assam and other
Yes.
places, and they had mentioned places such as Leopold, and we had a very fine Mumbai police um, assistant commissioner of police. Uh, I think it was Vishwas Nangre Patil who had gone and actually mentioned that, and he had gone and warned people that there is this place is under threat. So they were good people as well,
Yes.
but unfortunately the entire the machinery could never
System.
come together,
True.
because
True.
yes, because as a nation we hadn't given them the kind of tools, the kind of organizational capability that would have helped them to take on an attack of such magnitude.
That's very true. There were news that the Hemant Karkar is, for example, they did not have proper bulletproof jackets. They did not have a car. They
Yes,
were like
yes,
facilities
yes.
available at that time, wherein if you hit a bullet in the wheel, it can still go on for some 30 kilometers.
Yes,
These things
yes.
were available at that time, but luckily none of it we had. Another
It's
very important
unfortunate.
aspect.
Yeah, yeah. It's unfortunate, and we lost
Yeah.
lives which shouldn't have been
True.
lost. That's
True.
very unfortunate. Yeah,
And one very important aspect
yeah,
about Sandeep Sen, as you mentioned, so there
yeah.
was this confusion, Sandeep Unnithan was martyred, and Sandeep Sen's
Yes,
wife thought
yeah.
that it's her husband.
Hmm.
Do you see, and another, so do you see the media which was kind of in the frenzy was, in overhype, did this without understanding its responsibility? And also, this question is often asked, should the media have been given access to, should they have showed, everything on the
Hmm.
channels which was actually helping the
Yeah,
Pakistani handlers? So there
yeah,
should have
yeah,
been, norms set up what
yeah.
you can, show, what you cannot, because ultimately it has to be national interest above all. And when we talk
Right,
of role of
right.
army in nation
Hmm.
building, but when
Hmm.
we are
Hmm.
talking of a scenario of war, like everyone
Hmm.
actually,
Hmm.
every member of the society has a role. So do you think
Yep.
when we, this
Hmm.
is a perfect example of media in
Hmm.
particular
Hmm.
not doing its duty
Hmm. Hmm.
properly.
Hmm. No, Abhishek, that's a good question, and I have a slightly different view from a lot of other people on this. Yes, the media needs to act more responsibly, but who trained the media? Did anybody do
Right.
so? No. I mean, there were people who were, reporting. This hadn't happened earlier. Probably many of
Exactly.
them would have been reporting for the first time in their lives.
Right.
So I think the media also was not trained to handle this. So to squarely blame the media or the reporters would be a little unfair on a lot of these then young media reporters reporting for the first time. They were the experienced reporters who should have been more aware of
Yes.
things. But
Yes.
there were also very young reporters, journalists who were reporting. They didn't have much of an idea as to how this was being used by the militant groups. So that is number one. So for media also, it was a first kind of experience. I mean, the police did not know what was happening. The politicians did not know what was happening.
What was it?
Why blame the media alone? So I think the media also was beginning to figure out what was happening around them. By the time they had figured, the information had gone across. I am sure if they had known that what they were doing was actually harming the national cause, they probably wouldn't have. But yes, they should have been more aware and wary and aware of the conscious of the national cause. But I don't
True.
think they were trained to do that. They were not trained to handle this reporting in this kind of
Right.
a war zone. So, and what would happen if they did? As I said, some of the more experienced journalists could have been more cautious, but a large number of young journalists and reporters were reporting, and I don't think for them it was an experience that they had known of previous to
Right.
2611. And I think, for instance, many of them, very few of them would have seen any other kind of experience in the past. Some journalists would have seen the Kargil War, and I think those who would have seen the Kargil War, they could have been more cautious and
Yes.
wary.
True.
But a lot of young journalists who had just come into the reckoning in that decade may not have had any kind of experience of that nature in the past,
Right.
and they were not given any training. So they were just sort of tossed into the fire, and they were
Exactly.
there. Yes.
As you mentioned Kargil, so I think Kargil से दो बातें, एक तो one is the story of Shoaib, and another one was the story of Nizamu. Again, as I
Hmm.
mentioned at the beginning,
Hmm.
stories like this कहीं ना कहीं वो आपका faith restore करती है humanity में, and you think that we can think of a future maybe without wars. That would be too simplistic a thing to say.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
stories like this कहीं ना कहीं आपको एक feel good वाला factor आप कह सकते हैं कि humanity है, जब आप battlefield पर भी आप अगर एक ऐसे मिलिटराइज जोन में है, आप कहीं ना कहीं ह्यूमैनिटी देख सकते हैं. देयर आर
Hmm.
पीपल हु
Hmm.
थिंक
Hmm.
बियॉन्ड द आर्मी लाइंस,
Yeah.
बियॉन्ड
Yeah.
बाउंड्रीज एंड ऑल.
Yeah.
हाउ डू यू सी दैट, एंड डिड यू
Hmm.
कम अक्रॉस मोर स्टोरीज जब आपने रिसर्च
Hmm.
किया, मोर सिमिलर स्टोरीज?
Yes, yes. You see, there are stories of this, but for every Shoaib or every Nizamu, there are hundreds of those people who are probably Shoaib's boss who was trying to bomb the hell out of India,
देयर आर
or the
बुरहान वानीज
militant
एज वेल.
Haburan Wani. So therefore, everyone there would be hundreds. So my other point of highlighting this was also the fact that in insurgency in Kashmir, there are young men who had gone astray, who have come back, and
कम बैक.
who have got their place and space. And which is I always talk about this, that I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little bit, but just to give you a little bit more context, when and because I served in the 90s in the valley, so when I first went in, वो 5 साल ही हुए थे insurgency के, and the militant groups were very clear that in 5 to 10 years they will bring India to its knees. They
यस.
did not know what they were getting into. They did not know that in due course they would be completely destroyed and dismantled, and they would be on their knees. And today, 35 odd years after the movement started in 1989-90, the militancy movement started. Can you see the internationalization of the Kashmir issue? No. Unlike
राइट.
Gaza, unlike Ukraine, unlike several other hotspots in the world which have actually been internationalized, where are so many other human rights abuses, so many different kinds of things, Kashmir has remained a local issue, an issue here. Nobody's interfered and nobody will. And the shray, the kind of the honor or the success, the reason for that is the Indian Army, because they have had a significant role to play over the last 35 years from the time
राइट.
the local administration collapsed. The stories here bring forth two kinds of things. One is the return of the militant back to normalcy. So that is the story of Nizamu. And it also tells you that a young officer in Kashmir is actually, he had his ear to the ground, because in that story, the young officer defies the orders of his
यस.
superior, of his commanding officer. किसी ने मुझसे पूछा, ये कैसे हो सकता है? तो
राइट.
इसमें ऐसा है ना कि जैसे for for every Nizamu, there are 100 of other militants and others, and for every for hundreds of good, thousands of good deeds, you will have one army officer who's probably not very much aware of what's going on and who would give misplaced orders. So it's also important to highlight that the young officers who had their ear to the ground also had the moral courage, had the
Yes.
moral courage to defy, had to
Right.
highlight that moral courage. So ये नहीं है कि आपको हुक्म मिला है आप हुक्म के गुलाम हो गए. No,
Right.
he defied that because he believed heart of heart that this guy had come back, surrendered to him, because and once he had surrendered, he felt a moral obligation to protect his life. So
True.
that is something that we highlight there, that we see this, that this is something that happened where he believed, nahi, aisa nahi karna chahiye. And that kind of uh, that thought arises in him as Nizamu is about to be shot. And this is a true story. This is a true story which I heard from the protagonist himself. And the name was changed to protect his identity. But the protagonist himself, and when I heard this story, I thought of including it to highlight the complex nature of wars that India has had to encounter from the 1990s. So, if you see the three sections, there are very different kinds of sections. And the
Yeah.
last section is again a section where the global order changes, communism collapses, the Berlin Wall collapses, Soviet Union dismantles, different kinds of issues come up, and the emergence of Taliban and other movements on that side of the world meant the rise of insurgency in Kashmir, and then the complex issues of identity wars, insurgencies, low intensity conflicts start. And when the adversary does not have a uniform, cannot be identified, he is or she is amongst us. And that's where the complex nature of the battle start. And that's where you had the story of Nizamu. And it also tells us that the Indian army is not just about um, killing and shooting the
Yes.
militancy or the militants.
Yes.
Yes, we will. The Indian army knows how to ensure that the hardest on the so-called core, strong, the hardcore militants have an appointment with their maker. That
Yes.
Indian army has ensured, but
True.
it also ensures that those who are willing to come back can be part of the mainstream once again. And there is a heart, and there is a heart, that of a soldier that allows one to do that. And I think that was the highlight of that story, and the friendship between the two also highlights that you're a part of the country, and you'll always be if you're willing to be.
Right.
And if you're not willing to
Very.
be, then you can choose a path of your own.
So in your book, you covered the army history till 2008. And how do
Right.
you see situation has changed for the army after 2008? Or maybe to put
Hmm.
it more specifically, how do situation change after 2014? There are two
Yeah.
instances
Yeah.
wherein we, gave a befitting reply to
Hmm.
Pakistan. How do
Hmm.
you see
Hmm.
things have changed for the army, especially after 2014?
So I think I will just answer it slightly differently. We have had an advantage as far as Pakistan is concerned, and we
Yes.
have established the military advantage in 71 and 99 Kargil, in insurgencies, in counter insurgencies in Kashmir. What has happened in the surgical strikes in 2017 is that it sent a very strong message to Pakistan that we could India could actually mount attacks in the POK area, which something that sent a very strong message in that period. It also ensured that Pakistan did not sort of ramp up its support to the militants. Though, if you over the years, if you see the last few years, the militancy in Kashmir has actually gone down. The abrogation of 370 has also helped in cutting off funds to militant groups which were surviving and which were actually thriving because of the supply of funds and
Yeah.
equipment and support from across the border, from overseas, etc. So yes, it has the surgical strikes should be seen in conjunction with our efforts in Kashmir to restore peace. The last time I went to Kashmir was, a year and a half back, and one of the things I noticed firsthand, and I spoke with many of my ex-mates and others, was that there is a keen desire to get back to employment, to business, and that is what was driving the local population. You have
Yes.
had, so somebody says, but still there is a lot of issue. I said, 35 years se agar ye chalta aa raha hai, 30 saal
Mhm.
se, so it will take another generation for this to
Yeah, of course. Of
get to
course.
a state of complete peace. We are going through a state of catharsis. We're going through a state where we have emerged from a full violent a state of full violence to a stage where we are getting to a tentative peace, as I would say.
Yes.
There are occasions when this tentative peace is disrupted by bouts of
Yes.
violence, but that should not take away our understanding of the progress that Kashmir has made over the years. And I think one must give credit to the Indian Army. I remember talking to General Bipin Rawat some years ago when he was around, and when I was writing Watershed, and I'd gone to meet him. He was our commanding officer long back. So at that time, when I was writing the book, my first book, he was the army chief, and I remember he was quite clear that uh, he would drive away all kind of militancy before long in Kashmir. And during his tenure, there was a lot of work that was done, which is continuing to
Yeah.
be done. And I think that is something that gives us a ray of, not just a ray of hope. I think we have a big hope there in Kashmir. And the last time the Prime Minister was there speaking in Srinagar, he was that meeting of the Prime Minister, or the speech of the attendance there in the Kashmir, in the Srinagar Stadium, was in many many thousands, which hadn't
Yes.
happened for many years ago.
Right.
So
True.
these are symbols. The other thing that I would like to talk about here, पाकिस्तान तो है, ठीक है, वो जो हो रहा है हमने स्टैब्लिश करी है, हमने कश्मीर में काम किया है, across the border काम किया. The other thing that I want to very really highlight here, कि since you asked me as to what would the stories be, I think the stories now should be about India's role in the global order. We must look
True.
beyond Pakistan. I think Pakistan
Exactly.
is there, ठीक है. Abhi, the idea is to look beyond Pakistan, and we read about the Indian Navy, being involved in the rescue
Yes.
of travelers, of crew in ships which were hijacked and attacked by pirates of the coast of Africa, by Somalian pirates and others. So I think one of the things that we need to look at is the role of India in the global order. जैसे हम
Global.
पहले 100 साल पहले, so we've gone back the full circle. पहले हम we were being taken as mercenaries, as soldiers, as part of the
Yes.
Indian Expeditionary Force बोलते थे, IEF, in the First World War. और अब जो है, India is stepping out of its orbit and addressing issues in the oceans, and that, to me, is the next stage where stories should come more out of how in the Indian Army, in the military, which is primarily now led by the Navy, because it is in the oceans and elsewhere. But I think the experience, the role of the Indian military in the global order is one of the is perhaps the next stage that we would look at. I mean, if I were to look at the three stages in the book, that is the fourth stage.
True.
And by saying it's the fourth stage, we go back to stage one of this book, which is
Yes.
India and the world order. But now India is going by its own volition,
True.
and every second day, every third day, Abhishek, we read about the Indian Army's role in rescuing someone, in rescuing some crew, in rescuing some, किसी को यमन से लेके आ गए, किसी को
Yes.
you know from the oceans they have
Correct.
and मैं तो I was reading the news, I thought ये तो मैंने last week पढ़ी, but then I looked up, it
But
was
it happened
yesterday's
again.
news.
Yes.
so
True.
I wrote about it in first post, and I was telling somebody that uh, I want to write about it again, because it has a larger set of implications. To me, that is the next stage.
Of course. I think your readers and including myself would be glad if you pen down those stories and maybe come with a revised edition
Mm.
of Camouflage, or who knows, an altogether new book. But coming to your
Yeah.
first book, so
Ji.
1962
Mm.
was a defeat. And I
Mm.
think one of the things we do when we talk of army is that we look at the army thing in binaries. हम जीते या हारे, we battle
Ji.
जीते थे हारे थे. Your
Right.
books bring out a lot of other stories, whether it's related to humanity, human emotions, and lot many
Right.
others. But coming to your
Mm.
book on Watershed 1967, we lost in
Mm.
62. That is not
Right.
something we would
Mm.
like to be remembered again and again. We won in
Mm.
1967.
Mm.
Why is it we won something and it took us more than 40 years? It took you to write a book. Why isn't that something which should have been celebrated is not celebrated? And
Yeah.
why is it hardly
So,
anyone knew about it before now?
yeah. Yeah. So it's not 40 years, it's actually 53 years.
Oh yeah,
Because from,
67. Sorry, yeah.
yeah, 67, 53 years. And, well, I'll, I'll give you a small anecdote. I mean, I'll narrate a little anecdote to amplify what I want to say. In 2017, when India and China were having a standoff at Doklam,
Yes.
and if you remember, the media was, you know, all over talking about how China was pressurizing India, how India would have to backpedal, and all of that. And they were all talking about 1962, what happened in 62, uska rerun, uska run, usi ki narrative. So they were going on all of the time during 2017. I was having a chat with a friend, and I mentioned to him that I just asked him a question as to who won when India and China last fought, and he said it would have been China, and he said 1962. So I said, no, you're wrong. It's 1967, and that's how the story of my book started. Because when I returned, I was outside of Mumbai in another city, and I came back to Mumbai, and people approached me to write a book, and that's how the book took shape. And I believed it is a story whose time had come, whose the time of telling that story, the time of narrating that story to everyone had arrived. More so because I realized all over in the media and everywhere, people were writing, talking, discussing about 1962. There was no mention about 1967. I thought that everybody knew, but I was wrong. I realized that not just journalists or historians, army officers did not know. I
Sure.
must say this, and I have said this again and again. Army officers did not know. There were very few, handful of army officers who actually knew about 1967, and of those who knew about 1967, none of them knew it fully. So I think that was a task I took upon myself to write about a story that had never ever been written. So 1967 story, Watershed 1967, is the first ever book about India's victory over China. It's the first
Right.
ever book, not one of the first books. It's the first ever
It's the
book,
first one.
and I say this on record. Yes, there were articles written, there were some pieces written, here and there, which are very important in putting it together. Articles written about the Battle of Nathula, Battle of Chola, which
Yeah.
I used as secondary resources,
Yeah.
and also I needed to understand the context of it all. कि सिर्फ battles नहीं थी, इनकी significance क्या थी?
Right.
When we look at Dunkirk has a significance in the turnaround of Second World War.
Second
So
World War.
what was Nathula's significance in the turnaround of India-China relations?
True.
India wrested the advantage from China that it had given away in 1962. It wrested away that advantage by a redemptive victory 5 years later in 1967. And that changed the wheel of history, because in 1971, China did not interfere in the India Pakistan war. There were several other reasons, but one of the prime reasons, an underrated and forgotten reason, was 1967, when we registered a resounding double win over China in Nathula and Chola. That is a fact, and but हम आपकी सवाल, तो मैं एक लिटरेचर फेस्ट में गया, वहां पे लोग बोलने लगे नहीं नहीं, इंडिया was 71 में China didn't interfere because we had signed a treaty, we had done this with Soviet Union. I said yes, we did that. But
Okay.
why are we always parroting out reasons that we have been taught in our
Yes.
history as career professionals or students? We should be trying to figure out what were the other reasons, and
Yes.
that is where I set out to seek the right reason why 71 did not see the interference of China.
True.
So I told the panelists there that, yes, India signed a treaty with Soviet Union. Yes, there was a clause 9 in that treaty that, that enabled Soviets to come to our rescue if China had attacked in 71. So all of those things, the background work we had done. But why did China not even move its troops near Sikkim in 71? And the reason is that we go back to the victories of 1967. The other thing that, to your point of why we have gotten all of these, is that, I go back to that other, my earlier reason that, look, we did not we did not include military in nation building. So when we had when we had a political role, such as in 1971, Mrs. Indira Gandhi had a political role. 1965, Lal Bahadur Shastri
Lal
had
Bahadur
a
Shastri.
political role. But
Yeah.
ये जो 67 की जो victories थी, इनका जो रोल था, it was General Sagat and the army there, the local commanders, the leaders who had taken on this responsibility, the decisions to actually mount an attack on China, or take on China when the Chinese had opened up firing at Nathula. And because there was no political stakeholding there in 67, and
Yes.
it was purely an army or military victory, it
Right.
was forgotten very quickly. One. Second, India was always on the defensive, did not want to sort of rake up any kind of an issue with China. Also, India was kind of trying to figure out what is going to happen, because there was Pakistan, there were Americans who were also hostile. Soviets sometimes they were of great help in 71, but 65 may again, the treaty at Tashkent that happened resulted in the death of our prime minister. So it was a very complex scenario where India
Right.
was tentative, I would say, and in its relations globally, or its relations outside with different countries. So the writing of history, the writing of or the remembrance of those events was relegated to the background,
Yes.
perhaps because we thought that we would annoy certain people as we went on that route. The other thing is that, we are very poor archivists of history.
Oh yes.
And
I agree.
if we look at 1962, 1965, 1971, 67 को तो छोड़ ही दीजिए, 62, 65, 71 की हमारे पास में official histories ही नहीं है. We do not have official histories of these wars, the wars we lost, the wars we won. We don't have any kind of official history. I don't think we have an official history of 1999 Kargil conflict either. General V.P. Malik wrote a book. 1971, Srinath Raghavan wrote a book,
Yeah.
and some others did. 62, Neville Maxwell has written, which is anti-India. There is
Yeah.
Bertrand Lintner, who's written as well, which is again a counter to
China's
Neville
India
Maxwell.
wall. That
Yeah.
wall. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but these are all pursuits of historians who have,
Yes.
rolled up their sleeves, who have put shoulder to the wheel, and who have penned some very significant works of history, but there is no official history. And I think that is where we suffer from. We are poor archivists, and
Yes.
then we are, because of that, we have not been able to take our history to our people. I must salute all of the historians and others who've done a stellar work in doing whatever they have managed to do. But I think there are lots to be done. इसलिए मेरी दोनों किताबों में आप देखोगे कि, there's one forgotten 67 और ये forgotten stories from battlefields,
Yes.
because हमारी stories either forgotten है या तो
Forgotten.
unremembered है. Yeah.
Especially for 1967, was it difficult for you to get the relevant information? Because talking of
Hmm.
not maintaining an
Hmm.
archives, and this is
Yeah.
something which people don't
Hmm.
talk about much. So I guess for
Hmm.
both it would have been a task to look for the information.
Hmm.
But 67 wali book, do you find it more difficult to get the relevant info from our archives and any other sources?
So, yeah, as you see, even for camouflaged के लिए क्या है कि जो जो लास्ट 3-4 स्टोरीज है वो आई कुड गेट फ्रॉम sources first hand. But
Yes.
there are stories which are beyond, the First World War, Second World War. And ताज्जुब की बात यह है, you'd be surprised to know, most of these stories from that time, I have used the archives, the imperial archives in London,
Right.
or some have been are there in the Nehru archives in India. But largely, we haven't had anything post independence.
Yes. Yes.
67, now coming to 67, 67 may, it is difficult to get hold of archives because access to archives is again a tough issue in India. As an ex army officer, I can, and I, some, for instance, the historical section of MOD, Ministry of Defense, can be accessed, but there is a bureaucratic sort of channel, and you have to obtain permissions. So ये जो civilian scholars हैं उनके लिए access नहीं होता है इतने आसानी से in many places, which is not a very encouraging sign.
Right.
1967 में one of the advantages is that I could speak with several people who are still survivors of 1967, who have had a very robust memory of that battle or those times.
Yes.
And I include diplomats and soldiers, war heroes, others who were around at that time who I spoke with and who still retained a robust memory. You'd be very surprised that when I spoke with them, they were very clear in narrating what had happened at that time. And there was no waffling, there was no forgetting of issues and events and dates and times and hours. And I think they were very, very robust because I think that event, those moments, still held a precious space in their memories. But you have to rely on oral history, you have to rely on regimental archives जो regiments ने maintain की हुई है. I must salute the army units and the regiments who actually maintain, regiments, units में, brigade में war diaries maintain होती हैं. वो war diaries में वो mention किया जाता है that whatever happened on a particular day, what kind of movement happened, how many soldiers went out on a patrol, उनको क्या हुआ, कितने को गोली लगी, कितने लोग मर गए, all of that, the operational details are mentioned in the war diaries. And this is a culture, this is a tradition, this is an operational practice that has been in that has been going on from time immemorial. So first world war के भी जो war diaries है, those are there in the imperial archives, which I accessed to also include information from for Lance Dafadar Gobind Singh's story, for instance,
Yes.
which is the second story. So
Yes.
I included certain information from archives which have the war entries in the war diary. Similarly, 1967 is a combination of first-hand oral sources, some war diary information, regimental history, and that's it. So but I also say that once people, and I wish everyone a long life, but at some point of time, those survivors, those veterans of 1967 will pass away, and we hope that another book is also written around that time, which covers it from another dimension. But I think it's important that a period is covered through several books. That is
Right.
where we'll lend more richness to the uh, to the to the historiography of that period of our country. For instance, you look at 1947, we're still obsessed with it. We still write a lot more. Every year,
Yes.
there's a new book on the
True.
freedom
True.
movement.
Freedom
On
movement.
kabhi idhar se, we look at it from this dimension, that dimension. We have various, which is great. Which I don't see why we should not. But at the same time, we should look at these periods, these struggles, conflicts, and these various times where we have had conflicts with
Of
Pakistan or
course.
China, or internal conflicts, to be conveyed through several books and not just one. Which is
Correct.
when we will start to develop our understanding, interest, and information about a period in our
True.
country.
True. We'd be able to appreciate the importance of
Yeah,
not just
yeah,
the army, but all these events in a better manner. So, sir,
Yes,
talking about
yes,
army in general, you talked about both your books, as you have served the army
right.
for a
Hmm.
decade.
Hmm.
You talked about a bit about leadership in the beginning of this session. So, how do you think army makes leader out of you? And what advice would you give to any army aspirant?
Yeah. So, as a 23-year-old, there was an incident where, I was, we had someone, one of our soldiers who had got stuck in the minefield, and it was in the middle of the night, and I and a few of my soldiers had to go from another post. He was in my company. A company is a team of 130 odd people. So I was, as a young lieutenant, I was just officiating as a company commander there. So we had to, the team that was there uh, had to evacuate this officer, this young soldier who had got stuck in the minefield. His leg had got stuck, and these were mines of previous years, in 1965 ki mines thi, which had slid down the which had slid down the ridge. And it was in the summer, where dry twigs give rise to easy fire caused by Pakistani firing from across the line of control, and they would fire at our posts to cause fire, knowing well that our soldiers will get out of the bunkers to douse the fire. And when they would do that, the Pakistani posts will fire at these soldiers to cause casualties and deaths. That was one of the modus operandi. So in this, the as the fire had been caused by cross border, cross LC firing, land control firing, this soldier had got his leg stuck in the minefield, and it had got blown off. So he was evacuated by the team, and we had carried the soldier on our backs, and gone to the base of the hill. And as soon as we reached the base of the hill, there were rockets, solar powered rockets, that were being fired towards us. And this soldier had the leg blown off from under the ankle, so we had to tie, it was hanging, so we had to tie that part of the leg. And it was, by the time we carried him, a lot of blood had been lost, and we were looking for the ambulance. And at that point of time, I spoke with the adjutant. um, Adjutant is an officer in the unit who's in charge of the operations and other things, and who reports to the commanding officer. So
Yeah,
the adjutant at that time was Major Bipin Rawat, who then later rose to become the chief and India's first CDS. And proud to say that he was from my unit.
wonderful.
So Major Bipin Rawat was the adjutant, and I spoke with him on radio. I told him that, look, this is, they're firing rockets, and we have this casualty, and he was sending an ambulance. And that ambulance he had sent was, so the rockets were being fired every 10-12 minutes. We did not know who was firing the rockets. They were just, and we had about 15 people there at one place with a casualty waiting to be put into an ambulance. And those rockets had destroyed certain living accommodation close by, and they were being, we didn't know what those rockets were. Later on we realized they were solar power rockets. And because we had reached the base of the hill in the morning, and the sun had come up, triggering those solar power rockets. And that's why we could see a pattern, that the first rocket was at some point of time, followed by one in 10 minutes, then followed by another in 12 minutes, so on and so forth. So we could establish a pattern. Now, the ambulance that was to come had to come from behind a ridge, and from behind a ridge to where the evacuation had to be, or the casualty had to be put into an ambulance. The 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 place of exposure was about 300 odd meters, meaning if the ambulance would come around the ridge from behind, it would be exposed for 300 meters to the opposite side, to the Pakistani side, who
Oh,
are firing rockets. So the assumption was that, if the ambulance is sent to pick the casualties, to pick that casualty, to the soldier who was bleeding profusely, will that be a risk, and will the ambulance be blown off by the rocket? So I spoke with Major Rawat, and his one line at that time was, "What do you think? You're the man on ground." I, as a 23-year-old, 22-year-old, was given the responsibility of taking a decision on the spot based on what I thought was correct. And I told him that, look, there is 300 meters of risk exposure to the ambulance because it was in the line of sight of Pakistani rocket firing. And here was a soldier bleeding to death. So I needed to use the ambulance, but that's also a risk. So he says,
Yeah.
what other options do you have? I said, well, I need to save his life. He says, yes, I think you have the right objective in mind. Do what you have to do. So, well, we caught the ambulance. The ambulance traversed those 300 meters. We waiting for the rocket. अभी 10-12 मिनट का वक्त था
Hmm.
और हमने उस वक्त वो एम्बुलेंस को बोला from behind the ridge to come, and it traveled 300 meters. We put the casualty into the ambulance. The ambulance turned, went 300 meters. The rocket was fired. And as the ambulance crossed the ridge, went around the ridge, the rocket came whizzing past us, hit the ridge, and went away. And the ambulance was on the other side, just missed by the whisker. And but we had managed to save a life. So the lesson here was that you will never have 100% information. You will
Hmm.
have information enough to take a decision. And as a 20, like I said at the start of the discussion, that as a 22, 23-year old, if you're reposed with the faith, trust, and confidence of saving lives of men, soldiers around you, that gives you the self belief, the confidence of taking a decision that is the right decision in your life, in your professional career. One of the takeaways from the armed forces is the belief, the trust it reposes in its young officers in the in the frontiers of battles of wars, because those are life lessons. Those are
Yes.
lessons that you learn, and those are lessons that you retain. अभी मैं जो आपको बता रहा हूँ कि 40-30 साल 30 years 30 साल बाद ये बात बता रहा हूँ आपको, and I still have that inside my head. So wherever I have taken a call, a decision forever in my further in my professional career, one of the things I have always weighed is कि डिसीजन के वक्त एक डिलेमा होगा. डिलेमा क्या
Yes.
है कि आपके पास 2-3 ऑप्शंस होते हैं. चाहे आप जॉब का एप्लीकेशन फाइल कर रहे हैं या इंटरव्यू के लिए जा रहे हैं या कोई डिसीजन और ले रहे हैं, उसमें आपके पास में 2-3 ऑप्शंस होंगे. What is the right call is decided by a simple question in your head, which is what is the right decision that you take is decided by this one little simple question: which is the higher call? इसमें से which is the higher call? At that instance, at that point of time, saving a life was the higher call, rather than rather than not taking action and letting the soldier die. The fact that his life was saved was a call that one had to take, and that was an early lesson learned in life. And I remember Major Bipin Rawat for that and that experience, that he allowed a 22, 23-year old young
Hmm.
officer to take a call on the ground. I think the you know the stories मैंने जो हर स्टोरी में आप देखेंगे, many of these young protagonists are very young. You see the story of Haripal Kaushik, how he comes back from a setback and stages a very very important comeback to win the gold for India. The
Yes.
versatility, the ability to come back from jolts and come back from setback is one of the biggest gains or biggest takeaways from the Indian Army. लीडरशिप की बात सब करते हैं, बट लीडरशिप में जो लेसन्स है वो अधिकतर एक्सपीरियंसेस से, फेलियर्स से, सेटबैक्स से आती हैं. और
True.
वो
Very true.
सेटबैक्स तभी आप सीख सकते हैं उनसे जब वो रियल लाइफ में आप
Real life.
उनकी उससे गुजरते हैं. You read about them in textbooks and in classrooms, all very well, but these are the ones that teach you. Also, we talk about case studies today. We talk
Yeah.
about case studies, Harvard case study, this case study. We talk about war stories in the corporate. We say, oh, this is a war story I want to talk about. these are the real war stories,
Very
because
true. Very true.
these are real stories which talk about leadership, of camaraderie, and various other kinds of instances where you have trust in people alongside you, of teamwork. Some of these stories, 2611 ki stories, also of teamwork. You
No,
talk about the
of
ladies
course.
in Manesar and the
Yeah.
soldiers, fighting the terrorists, of teamwork. You look at the story of Militant and the Major, Nizamu's story, is also of teamwork, where he
Hmm.
says, "So what happened to Nizamu?"
Yeah.
The company commander asks his soldiers. He says, he disappeared in Jhelum. He is
Yeah.
so it's a teamwork that drives. It's the kind of trust, and you win the trust of the people who you serve with, because you are, you know you're genuine. I think that's one of the things that's important. And genuineness comes from moral courage. I think that's one of the
True.
things, one of the takeaways. So there are so many of them. Moral courage is, again, they're all interlinked. They're not like silos ki
Very true.
moral courage hai to genuineness nahi hai. Aisa nahi
Right.
hai. They're
Nahin,
all
nahin.
interlinked. And that's when I say that, one of the things that I wanted to bring about the themes here is to portray the culture, the tradition, the legacy of the Indian Army, एंड जिससे आपके वैलर, आपका मॉरल करेज, आपकी दूसरी चीजें, आपको जो बाहर देखने को मिलता है, द काइंड ऑफ वैलर दैट इज शोन, इज, it comes out of the legacy, the tradition, and the kind of culture that plays a
Very true.
big role in the
Of course.
in the conduct and performance of the soldiers and officers.
I think the example you gave is the proof of what you had to do at the age of 23. If I think
Yeah,
situations like these don't make you make a good leader out of you, then nothing else will. That itself was the
right.
best example.
Yeah,
So one
yeah,
last question before we end the session. I know two
sure.
amazing books, but are you planning to write another book? And if yes, when can we expect to
Yeah.
get hands on?
Well, Abhishek, that's always a very inviting question, and that's a question that I must answer in a particular way. Yes, is the short answer, and there's a bit of a
No,
long
but
answer. That yes, again, this is a story that's been a theme of our discussion today. That a lot of these stories are not told. So this is again a story that has not been told. It's a story that has not been told. It's a story that is very, very important to us. It also tells us why we have moved from a certain era and what happened in that particular decade and that era, and also before that. So it's a story of a particular protagonist, a central figure, again, someone who was important to the evolution of our history in the last, in the previous century, in the last 30, 40 years, but particularly so in a particular decade. Again, it's a story that also uh, encompasses events in that period, which were again central and important to our history, and what happened thereafter. Just as in Watershed 1967, the only answer that I can give you, the other answer that I can give you, is that this is not a book of short stories. It's more like Watershed 1967, but it's a story of a central figure, of an individual who played a key role, and the events surrounding him. So that is what it is. When I think hopefully we should have it somewhere in 2025, but it's still some way to go at this point. Not in somewhere, hopefully in the second half of 2025.
yeah, but till then, we have, Watershed 1967 and Camouflaged with us. And all those who are watching, अगर आपने ये नहीं पढ़ा, you have no idea what you are missing. Don't take it as a story of army. I think it's a story of India, of India's history, and not exclusively army history. What shaped India, you can say, over these 100 years. If you want to understand that, I think this is the book available online as well as all good bookstores. And one of the books I always, strongly recommend. So thank you so much for both these wonderful books. Definitely, I'm for sure looking forward to the third one.
Thank you, Abhishek. It was such a pleasure talking to
Same here,
you,
sir.
and I'm very happy that you have liked the stories, and you have actually, I must say that you have described it aptly, that it's not just the story of army, it's not just the story of military, it's the story of the country seen through a certain lens, which is
Right.
exactly how I wanted it to be. And I'm so glad that you brought it out very aptly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.